Hey, everybody. Welcome to the DevEd podcast. I'm your host, Joe Eames, and today on our panel, we have Jesse Sanders.
Hey, everybody.
Luis Hernandez.
Hola.
Mike Dane.
Hey, everyone.
Sam Julien.
Hey.
Brooke Avery.
Hey, everybody.
And we have a special guest today, Emma. And is it Mullers or Muellers?
Oh, Mulqueeny is my surname.
Okay. Gotcha. Mulqueeny. Emma Mulqueeny. Emma is our first, possibly only guest we've ever had who's been what's the term? It's knighted when you're male, but what is it when you're
Dane? Well, I've got an OBE from the Queen 2 years ago, I think.
Wow.
I'm not a knight because I'm not a man, but
right.
But my maiden name is Knight, so I kind of got both of them.
So that's pretty freaking cool. I don't know that I've ever chatted with somebody who's been OB is that what they call it? OB for the Queen?
OBE, yeah, Order of the British Empire.
Yeah, Order of the British Empire. Pretty freaking cool. We need something like that, for us.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. So you were bestowed this fantastic honor because of your work in digital democracy. Is that right?
And education.
In education. So with today's episode, we want to focus really hard on storytelling and learning through story in teaching. But I thought it would be interesting to at least chat a little bit about some of your work with digital democracy. It's the type of topic that you might see occasionally in your newsfeed, but isn't necessarily commonly discussed unless you might be a little bit more interested in that particular topic. But it'd be good to maybe have a little bit of a background. But before we get into that, actually, I forgot, we should have a brief introduction from you and who you are, what you do, your background, and all that sort of stuff. So if you want to give us that, then we'll get into questions.
So my background, really everything that I do is the fault of my dad. He's a computer scientist and a mathematician. And so when I was growing up for fun, and I grew up in the 70s, for fun, I would have a BBC Micro and I was programming computers and doing maths tests and Mensa tests and stuff, which was entertaining for him, but not quite so much for me. So actually, obviously, computer programming and gaming became the funner side of time with Dad. So I think from that, because, when you're a teenager, you tend to rebel, right, against your parents. So obviously my dad wanted me to go into one of these things. He foresaw what was coming, but I was absolutely certain that I didn't want to do this. But I was able to kind of bridge the gap between geeks and humans. So I was very good at translating what the geeks were saying in the kind of 80s and 90s, and then what everybody else needed to kind of understand. So I did my degree in English, and then I didn't actually finish it. I started my degree in English, and then I became an editor. So I was very much doing desktop publishing, and then I had a fantastic 2-year contract with Parliament where I was digitizing all of the papers that are set in front of Parliament and having to edit them and digitize them. So that meant that I was like Rapunzel spinning straw into gold, really. I kind of was stuck in a room in Parliament and just with piles of paper. And over those 2 years, I just became very good and quick at translating government speak into something that people would understand, but also technologies that would kind of make that quicker and sort of cheaper, I guess, in the long term. So I sort of married those two things, which brought me then into the heart of government. And I carried on doing words, really, and communication stuff, and which obviously led to much more of kind of strategy and engagement role and kind of explaining stuff to ministers, but working in government for about kind of 10, 15 years doing that. So not actually kind of really touching anything digital, but just being aware of what was going on and doing some really interesting work, but nothing kind of mind-blowing, But as we got towards the sort of big, middle to the end of noughties, so 2000 to 2010, data became the big story. So there was a lot of pressure for open data from government, and that was sort of partly about transparency, but also about reducing the cost of these kind of massive IT projects that were far too expensive. And so, but sort of being in my spare time, a little bit of an open data community fangirl, and spending my evenings with hackers in pub basements in London, and then going into work the next day to kind of explain to ministers and cabinet about what actually we mean by open data and what is good for them, and trying to remove some of that fear. And that kind of led to a movement and actually a competition between data.gov.uk and data.gov in America. I spent a lot of time kind of going backwards and forwards between America and London, and to see who was going to get it out first. But what grew up around that was that I thought it's all very well them, kind of making all of this data available for people to make use of, but we need to get people excited about government data. And at that point, I thought that, it wasn't a problem around skills and talent. I just assumed, even though I've got two daughters, I obviously wasn't paying that much attention to their IT education. I just assumed that people had the skills, and it would just be a case of getting them interested in the potential of having access to government data. So I started running hacks with Google. Google was still cool then. Kids wanted to go in and kind of see, or everybody wanted to go in and see their slides and their bean bags and their amazing chefs. And so I think it was around 2007, 2008. So I asked them if I could run a government hack there specifically for young people, because I've been running hacks in the government departments for kind of middle-aged, usually cross-white blokes. But I thought I need to get these kids excited about this stuff. So threw open the doors of Google for a weekend hack on government data, and 3 kids signed up, and I was like, this is nuts. Everybody wants to get into Google. And they allowed me to kind of put this off for 3 months. And for the next 3 months, I basically trolled all of the schools going, I need that kid that's in the library trying to break into the dinner menu and trying to change everybody's grades. Every school knew that they had one of those kids, but they also weren't teaching this. So that was the kind of the birth of Young Rewired State. Did eventually manage to cobble together 50 kids. And then that grew to a worldwide network of thousands of kids over the following 8-9 years, and kind of started this movement, which had just been intended to get people engaged with government data, but actually then became much more about a campaign for educating these kids in the skills that they need. And then because I was surrounded, not only because my own children who are now 27 and 17, but because of these thousands of kids that I was working with through Young Rewired State, and seeing how they were growing up in this kind of digital world, even though obviously the kids in Young Rewired State were natural born programmers, they were a very special community, or they are a very special community of young people. Through my children and the other kids that are around, I could see that there was a kind of a difference in awareness of these kids just because of what they were exposed to in social media. So being able to get news, more easily than we would have done when we were younger. I'm probably older than all of you, but where it would come from newspapers, now they were getting news in their news feeds much, much earlier. And also I was looking at the way their education was becoming more and more irrelevant. So I wrote a series of articles about what I called the 97ers generation, because 1997 seemed to be the cutoff between the kids who'd had to adopt social media and digital technologies, and then the kids that were born into it. So that kind of 97 seemed to be the cutoff for the kids that were born from then onwards, were born into a world of social media and kind of had missed the evolution, I guess, from analog to digital in daily life. And I was really seeing a big difference in the way that these kids kind of learned and shared and thought. And this series of blog posts was all it was, then led to a TEDx talk. And then I got this phone call in the middle of the day, and I answered the phone and they said, can you stand by for the Speaker of the House? So I know you have a Speaker of the House over there, so you understand this is just like, what?
Right.
I mean, right?
Right.
I mean, I'm kind of used to talking to ministers, but I was like, oh, okay. Wondering what I'd done, had I paid my tax. I don't know what I was. And he came on the phone and he was like, Emma Mulqueeny, I was talking about you in the airport in Scotland. And I was like, what? This has to be one of the weirdest moments of my life. And I was super nervous. And he said to me that he'd read some of the stuff that I'd been writing and that he wanted me to be on his commission into digital democracy, which was looking at how the digital revolution was going to affect democracy in the future, and therefore, and was already starting to change it then, and therefore how we could future-proof, democracy. So this was like 2015. So, quite 4 years ago. 4 years is a long time in our kind of massively quickly developing world. I was just like, yes, absolutely. And so sort of spent a lot of time that year on his commission, working with a bunch of really smart other commissioners, just really looking at all of the aspects of the digital world and how this would affect, the kind of, the political system of the future, which led to another TEDx talk, which I did in Germany, which I'm not quite so proud of because I sound like a robot, but never mind. But it was an absolutely fascinating year. And then after that, Rewired State and Young. So I had Rewired State was my commercial organisation, which just, I had a community of developers and we would just run hacks and mods and stuff for people to develop prototypes. I shut that in 2016. It had kind of lived its life. It didn't need to go any further. And I kept Young Rewired State going for a little bit longer. It became sort of too big and the community kind of took over it themselves, which is great, and they continue doing their thing, but they don't need me to run these massive festivals every year, thank God. And then I just started learning again, actually. So then I kind of like dipped back into it and started learning. And now I'm working in two areas. So with the NHS, looking at all of their health data and what we can do with that, and then also looking at mental health for young people, because obviously I think that's the biggest crisis that we're facing, that's become worse and worse over the last couple of years.
Wow, that's crazy. Before we really dig into our core topic here, which is about learning through story, I just wanted to briefly touch on digital democracy and sort of an understand for users that aren't familiar with the concept of, again, sort of summarizing, I know you kind of touched on this, but what is digital democracy and why is it something that people should be informed about?
So I think it's very difficult for people to kind of marry the digital world with the real world. So if you think of like bullying, right? People go, oh, bullying is this terrible thing online. It's just like, this is one of the scourges of online communities. Like bullying is bullying online and offline. Everything is the same online and offline. And people have this strange kind of red line between the two things. But actually, your digital citizenship, let's say, if you want to kind of use a slightly wanky word, you can bleep that out. It exists kind of online and offline. So what you're saying online is affected by what you're learning offline and the conversations that you're having. So actually these two worlds are not separate, and we need to move very quickly towards a kind of worldwide acceptance of the fact that this is in our life, it's here to stay, and actually our duty as people of the world extends to our behavior and responsibility online as much as it is offline. And so if you kind of then think about what that means about democracy, and democracy just means that your voice is being heard and that you've got people who are representing you. So if you think about what that means with all of the digital tools and information that's available for us, that means that we know a lot more about those who represent us. It also means that, a lot more of us are kind of community leaders, if to use analog terms. We might belong to multiple groups, some groups of people who specialize in knitting green frogs, or some groups who specialize in wooden Buddhas, but then also we might be a listener in a grief circle because we've experienced some kind of loss. And so you're actually a member of multiple communities which have no relevance to the geography of where you actually live. Whereas, not that long ago, and definitely before any of this digital stuff was available, your community was really limited to your family, your work, and then your friends, and where you lived, where you worked, and when you went on holiday. And people would have to go out of their way to actually engage with their community, so lots of people didn't. Now, it's very different. So digital democracy is really about thinking about the values of democracy, thinking about the fact that, we need our voice to be heard by people who are making decisions that will affect our lives, but we do not want to be the people who are going and making those decisions every day. Everybody's got too much to do. So we still want people to kind of represent us, but instead of, the olden days, certainly in England, where, the member of parliament would jump on a horse and ride to Parliament, taking the wishes of the people, to the House and standing up and saying, the people in my village say this, and then coming back from Parliament on their horse and then telling everybody in the village what Parliament has said, which is basically what it's still like, except without the horses. Now, actually, in a digital world, that's not the same, right? The horses are the algorithms. We need to have representatives, but we also just need to accept the fact that there are different ways for us to gather information, to share information. And we do ultimately need to think about borders and boundaries and how that affects it. But if you start going down that road, it's like a kind of domino effect that you probably really don't want to do.
All right. Okay, well, let's jump into some of our core topics here. I wanted to talk about storytelling. You were involved in this Young Rewired State and Get Coding. So is the core of it the book that was published?
Yeah, we had set up Young Rewired State, and because at that time, there was no education groups, there were no easy ways for anybody to learn coding. This was just a bunch of kids who taught themselves how to code and mentors from the community who were helping them. And a publisher actually came to me asking me to write a personal book about my story. And I was like, that's absolutely not what the world needs right now. What the world needs right now is a way for parents and teachers and people just to take some of the stuff that we've learned through Young Rewired State about how to bring people into the world of coding and helping them to kind of understand what it was all about and move it from there. So we got a bunch of Young Rewired Staters, so kids and their mentors and us, and we kind of just sat around and worked out what would be the best way for us to put this book together. And we actually learned a lot from Ian Livingstone, who'd been a great champion of ours, and he wrote all of those books, where you the Thunder Mountain books where you roll a dice and you turn to page 15. Do you remember those books? Do you know those ones?
Oh yes.
So
those.
you get to the end of a chapter and then you roll a dice or you choose, if you want this to happen, go to page 18. If you want this to happen, go to page 27. So we thought that those books were actually really good at kind of teaching the whole Boolean theory of if this, then that. And what was great about it was that actually was the kind of, the founding thing of, the gaming world, really. But actually, we thought that this could be a way to bring kind of just simple HTML, CS, and nothing, Java, nothing too complicated that would make it just really easy for kids and parents and everybody just to kind of just get their hands dirty and make something and do something. So it was that. It definitely wasn't me, it was us, and with a massive dollop of Ian Livingstone's inspiration.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let's talk a bit about story and how the role of story in teaching and in learning. I would say that for myself, I have encountered this sort of a concept relatively rarely in learning. I've been exposed to a few online places that do some teaching and some education through some kind of storytelling-based methods. And when I think of this, I think it's like, the adventure story. The one example I could think of is Flexbox Zombies. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has tried that one out.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like this story you're going through. There's like almost a plot. There's dialogue, all that sort of stuff. You're going through and learning at the same time, which I found to be very interesting personally, but it also takes a lot of time, right? And there's a lot of content that's in there that isn't necessarily just the learning. But when you're looking at stuff like this, like let's go through the panel and just say, what's your impression? Have you encountered opportunities to learn that involve story? And in that case, what was your impression of the materials that you went through?
So I'm going to jump right in on this. And this is where I'll bring back the Get Coding books that Emma was part of authoring there. Because that, to me, when I was first learning how to program, I was going through all sorts of tutorials on YouTube or in boot camp all over the place. And depending on the teacher and how they would present the material, I think some of it's more approachable than other places. But the first time I can remember just that introduction to programming, like really clicking in my head, was the Get Coding books. Because I think it was done so well where, you're given this little story. You are put into this little world where you are exploring, you become part of this team, and they've discovered a diamond that's been stolen by some thieves, and then you're given little objectives and missions that you have to go and try to solve by building a website, your first website, to help this exploration team go out and publicize that they just found this world famous jewel. And like I said, it was the first time that programming really made sense in my head, and I think it was because it was in that story format. It made it more approachable. It made learning difficult things fun. And you go through the book like a story, and so there you are reading a story, and that's what you get sucked away into, is this story, and you almost forget that you're having to sit there and think and learn and do things. But the story is what made it fun, and it made it approachable and doable. So to me, story really takes difficult things and puts fun back into it. And especially for children, it kind of gives it a totally different mask. Kids don't want to be stuck in a classroom because they don't want to learn. But if you make it fun and they don't realize they're learning, then they're all about it. So I love those books. I think they're fabulous.
I think for me, I can't remember a time where I've had a direct experience where I'm learning through a story, although I think one experience I have had is with coding games. So this is actually something that was mentioned on the podcast like weeks ago, but this game Screeps, where you're basically programming these little like AIs, and it's this kind of like online game. And I think the whole point, and I like that game because you get to program, but the point isn't to program. The point is to build out these little AIs and win this game. And I think anytime where you have a course or you have something where the end goal isn't necessarily coding, the end goal is to, have some outcome that's not just, oh, I wrote this function. It's like, oh, you can see something happening, whether it's like fulfilling the plot of a story or in the case of the game, like winning the game. I think that's a different way of coming at the education. And ultimately, I think it makes it more fun because the goal isn't just to learn coding. The goal is to actually like do something else.
Back in the day, Code School did a really good job of this. I don't think that content exists anymore, but when I was transitioning to JavaScript professionally, they had these courses like JavaScript Road Trip, where you were like on a camping trip and had to like program JavaScript based on this like camping adventure. And it was really fun. And I retained a lot from it.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I did those same courses on Code School, and it definitely kept it more interesting. When I think about my 7-year-old and starting to teach him about these kinds of concepts, I can definitely see where a story would help keep him engaged, where he might otherwise just sort of float off and not want to participate. And so I can definitely see how this type of learning would really help facilitate that interest.
The trick with this kind of learning, though, is that, and I don't want to name specific websites, but there are some that it becomes too much of a game and the learning gets lost to the objective of the game. And so I think there's a real balance that, if you are someone who's setting out to create this kind of product, or if you're trying to introduce your children or just new learners of development, you want to choose ones that don't get lost in the gaming, but that still keep the educational value. And, the focus really should be on the learning, but not so much the game playing, if that makes sense. I think codecombat.com is a good example of that. They've found a really good balance there where there is a game, there is that fun element, but when you're going through the game, you still have to think, and it's still very much educational forward. So I just think you have to be careful with that.
It's sort of similar to what we were talking about last week with Shy, where it's like the fun you have to have a balance between what's fun and what's educational and strike a balance there. I love Code Combat. It's awesome. I want to play it as an adult.
Right? I agree. It's pretty fun.
I know we mentioned quite a bit about learning coding for kids and the role of story in that. But again, what about as adults, right? I think we had one of the panelists was saying that doing the code school was pretty interesting because of the story there. But learning as adults, does story still have a place in learning coding for adults?
So it depends how mathematically minded you are. So I think if you have a mathematical brain and a logical brain, then actually learning coding in a kind of mathematical way and more kind of game programming, you would probably not need so much of the storytelling. You've got to understand the maths. Whereas I think if you are learning more front end and it's more about kind of the logic, I guess that kind of, that Boolean, if this, then that, then I think storytelling is the only way you can really get people to engage with it. But I would say for game programming or mathematical programming, no. For front-end logical programming, yes.
I think we can all, I don't know that it matters how old or young you are. I think storytelling can play a role in your education. I think, though, it's sort of similar to why adults stop playing video games because, adulthood kind of takes over and you start feeling this responsibility of not just wasting your time playing a game. So I think, if this were done with web development, I think adults would relate more to storytelling, not so much through gameplay, but maybe through more real world scenarios. Like if the story was of a real world job situation and you were trying to, solve a challenge for a job, I think it would be more approachable for adults that way, taking out the silly game and making it more real world.
For at Auth0, we have to, of course, do like security training and stuff. And every year we have to do the OWASP top 10. And this last year, our security team went way above and beyond and created this fake hacking site and built in an emulated terminal. And you actually had to script the responses to all the OWASP top 10 attacks. And I've never done such a fun OWASP training in my career. And I think it was a great example of it was very practical, but it was also really fun. And there wasn't a lot of story, but it was still it was very interactive, but simultaneously real world. They were demonstrating these different phishing attacks and cross-site scripting attacks, and you actually had to write the code to fix it. And I thought I was completely impressed that they took the time to do that for our training. And I thought it was a great testament to that.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. We as developers, we have so much stuff that we're trying to learn all the time. And sometimes learning can get a little mundane if it's just having to sit down and read technical specs and try to figure out okay, how's this all work together? But I think that sometimes in certain scenarios, I think we're at one, again, that we're all different types of learners and we all have ways that we learn best. But I think that having either some sort of backstory, like what you just said there, Sam, where there's this hacking site, you've got this terminal, you need to try to respond to all 10 of these deals. And so you've got some interaction there and there's a meaning and a purpose to why I'm learning. Versus a gamification, even something like CSS Critters or the zombie game, we could take something that can be a little bit monotonous of learning CSS, and because we all have a basic understanding of how to do CSS, but we're trying to learn a new approach and really ingrain that into our mind, where doing the repetition over and over on our own probably isn't going to happen. But when we have the gamification, that keeps us engaged, and we're very focused on continuing to learn and implant that information into our subconscious so that we can use it later.
I think that's a really important point you just made there, Jesse, that by using stories, you're kind of giving people a common, a goal to be working toward, a learning objective that, that
exactly
focus of what they're driving towards. So I think that stories can be a powerful way to, it can be that driving vehicle, like you're saying, to give people that learning objective of what are we doing here? What is my purpose here? and not that you can't have that without a story, but I just think a story makes it more approachable and more enjoyable for everybody.
So I think sometimes too, a story can help kind of water down what you're doing. So a lot of times these technical concepts like programming, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, whatever it is that you're learning, they can be really technical. And so the story kind of acts as a way to bring you into those topics and introduce them to you without having to just kind of be confronted with all of it at once. Like the story eases you into it more. So I think that helps with motivation.
Well, I personally think it's kind of fascinating that, and maybe it's because of the definition of what story is when it comes to education, but I do think it's interesting that as humans, we're wired for story, right? That's how we as humans have learned throughout history, and only recently when we invented writing and other forms of communication did we find other ways to learn. But other than that, it was, story was how we learned, and it was such an effective communication mechanism that if you look into all types of sales and communication, you find that underneath it all lies the heart of storytelling, right? But again, when you get into this sort of education, I find that sometimes that a game type of a story can, again, be just distracting as an adult, right? I'm not looking necessarily for that in my education.
I think just from the conversation that you guys were just having, I think it sparked a memory and a connection that I hadn't really thought about with regards to kind of storytelling and education. And that's in some of the health work I've been doing with Telefonica in Barcelona, where we've been looking at, health tech of the future, I guess. So looking at all the med tech stuff. And whenever we got people together to do some design sprints, it always came down to the story of you. So how can we get people to empathize with their own selves and their own health in any tools that are being developed? And the only way that we came up with really was that there would have to be some kind of digital representation of you. And then if you get involved in any kind of service design or user research when you're developing stuff, it does come down to the kind of story of you. So I wonder, I'm definitely riffing here, but I wonder if, part of the storytelling that we're talking about in education is actually about how you translate the story of your own life and what's relevant to you into the tools and applications that you might want to build.
I definitely agree with that. I think the more that you can relate to your learning, I think the more you're engaged in that learning. So if a story is what it takes to help you to become more engaged in that, and relate to the material, then I think it's effective teaching and learning. So I totally agree with that, Emma.
Yeah, for me, it's sort of a sliding scale depending on how familiar I am with the topic. Like if I'm learning something else in JavaScript, chances are I just want to read the docs and get it done. But if I'm learning a brand new topic, like if I were to start learning Swift or something that I know absolutely nothing about, I'll probably start at a really broad, abstract, almost childlike level and narrow my way down as I get more and more practical with it.
So I have a question then, because there's really not a whole lot of storytelling in web development currently. I think, like I said, we have got these Get Coding books that Emma and her team put out. But other than that, I haven't really come across too much storytelling. So as adult web developers, what can we be doing to help produce more of that kind of content? And do you even think that it's valuable? Do you think it's worth our time to be creating it? And if so, how can we start to do that? What needs to take place for that to happen?
I can kick you off with just the process that we went through. I definitely think it's valuable to do this. And I think if you were to spend a little bit of time, which we did, just looking at the stuff that was produced for the BBC Micro, so that first computer, which came with lots of instruction manuals, and they were there really to teach children maths and English, and they used a lot of gaming and storytelling to do it through those floppy disks. And then, a mixture of that with Ian. And there's another set of books by Osborne. And I think we've kind of moved so far into the digital world that we've forgotten the analog and how important the analog is. And we do actually need that manual. I think in the 70s and 80s, the education in programming was outstripping the education that we have in programming now. So my quick answer to that is that yes, it's definitely valuable, but we do have something that we can fall back on. We just kind of forgot about it for the last 20 years. So I would say the value would be go back to the 70s and 80s, look at what we started, pick that up and carry on.
I totally agree. I think it's super valuable. And I think the easiest way to kind of implement this is just to do it on a micro scale. I really liked what Sam was saying, how his team took the OWASP training and kind of gamified it and made it into a story. I think as developers and even people that aren't developers or just in this industry, like we always have opportunities where we're giving trainings or explaining things or going to talks. And if you can just make that extra effort to add a little story or add that little extra, kind of analog detail to a talk or to a training, I think obviously it made an impact on Sam, and I think it can make an impact on a lot of people. So approaching it from a more micro scale, like just do it in your everyday life.
All right. Let's move into one more question and then we'll wrap up. So we talked about story for a little bit for, its role for kids. We talked about story a bit in its role for adults and in the landscape of web programming. As consumers of media and oftentimes creators of media, do you feel like story has played a part in what you've done so far in your education as both consumers and as creators of educational materials? And when I'm speaking specifically in programming education here, like what part has story played in your learning as a programmer?
I can go back and just share that introduction that I had again using those Get Coding books. And that was really what took my level of understanding and actually gave it something concrete to build upon. So for me, it played a significant role. And I actually find myself going back and referring to those books from time to time, just for a little inspiration or a little check-in on my coding knowledge. So for me, it was pretty significant just to get me up and going with development. Since then, though, I can't say it's been very impactful. I don't really find very many opportunities to learn the level of web development that I'm at, with stories. I don't really know of very many sources. I can go back and name some of those websites again, like I just forgot the name, the Code Combat. So there are some websites like that, but as far as like rigorous learning, I don't think there's enough resources yet. I think it would be tremendously beneficial to the industry if we kind of saw more in this direction.
Yeah, I would kind of parrot that a little bit for me. And I wonder if maybe I'm just a bit too autistic or something, that a good reference manual sometimes wins out the day. I think it was Sam that was kind of saying something a little bit similar to that. But oftentimes I feel like I want to get to the heart of something. And if there's much of the way of story, few times that I've been exposed to it, I almost found it a little bit distracting. So I sort of self-selected myself or removed myself from those educational things that I've encountered that have incorporated a lot of story as I've been learning programming and computer tech. But I wonder if some of that has to do with not just my own personality, but also just the way that story has been used in education. If it seems sometimes as we're talking about this, that there's only two options. Either it's this game, right? And now, as we sort of mentioned before, the game takes over and the education sort of falls secondhand, and it's rare when that's not true. And so as an adult, oftentimes, you want to get to it, and I don't want to hear the game, I don't want to read the flavor text, so to say. If it's either that or else it's nothing at all. And if those seem to be the only two options, and maybe the problem is that people haven't been incorporating story in an effective manner for your typical adult.
So I think I started coding way too early for any of this to impact me personally. I started learning how to code in the mid 80s on a TRS-80 color computer. And that it was just a book. That's all we had was books to learn from. But now, it probably doesn't impact me as much on a day-to-day basis for what I'm learning now, though I am interested to say, hey, some of these look kind of like they kind of be fun way to learn how to do FlexGrid or some of these other things. But the one thing that I'm realizing as I'm hearing everybody talk here is that there's an opportunity to, as I'm creating courses, as I'm creating talks, that if I just took a little bit of time to add a backstory to it, so that I gave people a little bit more context as to the why we're doing these things versus just explaining the technical aspects, that would actually create a lot more value for people and give them the opportunity to be able to relate this back to what they're trying to do on a day-to-day basis. And I think just taking that extra little bit of time to create that backstory and the why, and here's the problem that we're solving, that I could see how that would help a lot of people be able to make that leap in learning something new.
I completely agree with that. And I think that the connection that's been made for me over the course of this conversation is that, because I thought of storytelling as kind of a separate thing, but coming back to the fact that whatever assuming we're teaching people how to program in order for them to create products in the future that are useful for people, one of the primary things that everybody has to learn is that you can't make something pointless or people won't use it. So you've really got to think about the why, which means that you've got to make up the story. And any agency will do user research, will actually make the user the kind of heart of what it is that they're doing. So they'll develop stories, they'll develop personas and build their products and test those products in sprints against the original story that they've built. This conversation is that we've moved from just teaching through to actually creating development of apps, but I've not connected before that storytelling element. So I think that's really interesting. And what you were saying about developing your courses with having the why built into the heart of it means that we'll actually create a whole load of developers who do actually have the right training to be able to develop the products that people will use in the future.
Awesome. Anybody else want to chip in here before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. I'm thinking back on experiences I've had learning from stories, and I can't really come up with too many. And I do think that it's valuable. So I think, maybe as an evolution in this industry of, programmer education, it's something that we need to move into more. I don't think there's enough good examples out there to really, inspire people to teach this way. So I think it's definitely an initiative that people need to take. So,
all right. Well, if that's it, then we'll wrap up. So, Emma, I'm not sure if you had gotten the note for this, but what we like to do when we wrap up is to go through and ask everybody a question. And the question is, pick something that you would recommend to a friend or tell a friend about. And so it could be anything in your life that you discovered recently or rediscovered that you think is awesome and you want other people to know about that thing, whatever that might be. So we'll finish up with that. Luisa, are you ready to go first?
Yeah. My daughter's got me into it, Minecraft, which is interesting because it sounds like a game, but actually you learn a little bit about electronics and how circuitry works by playing the game. So I recommend people that haven't played around with Minecraft, give it a try.
Awesome. Sam?
I have still been on the Mac automation kick, and I've been experimenting with Siri shortcuts on my iPad, and it's a really interesting way you can automate like calendar events and note taking and stuff like that. So I've been trying that, as well as a new writing application called Ulysses. It's not new, but it's new to me. And I've really, really enjoyed writing in Ulysses lately. So those will be my 2 picks for this week. Cool.
Brooke, what about you?
I have a couple. I'll just refer everybody to the website for the Get Coding books. So it's getcodingkids.com. I definitely recommend, if you have anybody who's wanting to get into programming, those books are excellent at helping to make web development approachable. So getcodingkids.com. And then another one that, as I was kind of getting ready for this episode, I came across some, I think it was material that Emma had referred people on her website to. And one of them is this website called Alice.org. And it's a really fantastic website that it's basically like block-based programming that makes it easy to make animations and building interactive narratives and like 3D games. But you are developing it, you're programming it, but you're making these stories. So it's exactly what we've been talking about today. Pretty cool stuff. I don't know how much it's been built out in recent years, because I think the guy who was behind it unfortunately passed away, but boy, did he start something pretty fantastic. So I don't know, maybe Emma, you could kind of talk about it a little bit more if you know anything more, but alice.org.
I think alice.org is an amazing opportunity for someone to take what he did and continue. I agree with you. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic resource. But, no one else has done anything quite like that. There's just been a lull, really, right? So education's kind of gone back to, we've got to get these kids to pass some exams, so let's make it a bit dull. But there is a huge opportunity here. But I did read the notes. So the two things that I would recommend, I mean, there's loads of kind of, learning to program stuff that I've put on my own website. You'll find through the Get Coding books, or if you just Google me, you'll find stuff. But really, the brilliant storytellers. So there are two things. One, read all of Ian Livingstone's books again, because they're fantastic. And that really is the basis of a lot of gaming and coding nowadays. So, go get back into those books. And then I am actively sharing with people one of the best storytellers of our time is a guy called Gerald Hoffman, Hoffnung. And on YouTube, there's an hour-long interview with him called "The Importance of Being Hoffnung." It's very old. There's an American interviewer interviewing this English guy, and he rambles on, but he tells the most fantastic stories. So, as ever with this kind of digital and analog world, I would highly recommend both Hoffnung and Ian Livingstone's books, and then see where that takes you on the inspo of whatever you're doing in your journey.
Awesome. Jesse, have you gone yet?
Yeah, no, I've not gone yet, but I've got a couple. So for me, a lot of things that I'm looking at is like keeping motivated and keeping goals in the front of my mind. And two sites that I like, one is called TUT, TUT.com. That's a website that produces something called Notes from the Universe. You get a daily email. It's around goals and pretty cool thing that I like to check out every morning. And another one that I really enjoy is Momentum Dash. So this is a Chrome plugin. Every time I open up a new tab, it's got a really cool image. I can add a to-do list on there. It's got a really cool saying or some sort of focus point to think about. And so those are two cool things that I wanted to bring up today.
Mike, are you ready?
Yeah, I have been watching this course by Uncle Bob, actually, Robert C. Martin, friend of the show. And it's basically like an advanced TDD course, so test-driven development, and it kind of compares the two main schools of test-driven development, like the London school, which is all about mocking, and then the Detroit, Chicago school, which is kind of like what Uncle Bob does, which is less about mocking and more just about using actual dependencies. I think there's a lot of confusion in the test-driven development world around those two approaches. So this series of videos basically has him building out this like Twitter clone, and he does it in the Mockist style and then in the kind of non-Mockist style. So I've been loving that course. It's really cool. Definitely more of an advanced course, but if you're interested in TDD, I'd check it out.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll go last. It's something I'm much more lighthearted. In the summer, the TV networks oftentimes put on these kind of crazy, interesting semi-reality shows. So like America's Got Talent and stuff like that. And occasionally there's some gems in there. And I discovered one that was pretty darn entertaining to watch with the kids. It's a show called Holy Moley. And it is where miniature golf, or sometimes I think in some parts of the world they call it crazy golf, meets extreme. It's like extreme miniature golfing. It's absolutely hilarious. They're on contestants are basically on a kind of obstacle course. And so at some points they're getting hit by these big padded arms that knock you off the course while they're trying to putt. And other places they're racing each other up a slippery slope to try to be the first one to putt. And it's absolutely hilarious. Super fun to watch. Relatively well done. So I highly recommend that you watch it out. Very family friendly. Holy moly. And so that'll be it. That'll wrap us up. Thanks again, Emma, for coming onto the show. Appreciate you taking time. And thanks for all our panelists as well. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. And we'll be back with our next episode.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.